Hello everyone and welcome to Total Quilter Monthly for February 2019. My name is Mark Garetz and I'm a National Floriani educator. And this month we're going to be going over how to create some custom motifs for use in your quilts that use appliquilt blocks. Now when we create a quilt in the hoop block, one of the challenges is how do we finish up that entire quilt. And my favorite way of joining appliquilt blocks or any kind of quilt in the hoop blocks together is with something called the Jenny join, and it was popularized by our own Jenny Haskins. And the way this works is that your quilt block is completely finished in the hoop, including the backing. You trim the block to the exact size with no seam allowances at all, and then the blocks are attached to each other with either a zigzag stitch or a decorative stitch, and you can see the final effect in one of the quilts over there on the right hand side of your screen. So these blocks are completely finished, trimmed to their exact size, put together, and I like to tape them together with our wet and gone tacky tape on the back side, flip them over, use an edge joining foot, and then use a decorative or zigzag stitch to put the blocks together. An alternate method is to use a zigzag stitch and hide that with a piece of bias tape or other fabric faux sashing strip, but the decorative stitch method I think is the best, easiest, and fastest way to do it. So when we make appliquilt blocks in Total Quilter, we use binding stitches to assemble the pieces, the backing, and the batting together into a finished block. These binding stitches are either special appliquilt binding stitches, or you can use the motif stitches that are built into the software. Now when we put the blocks together, putting block to block, assembling the quilt, we use the decorative stitches or motif stitches that are built into our sewing machines, and they're different than the ones we use to assemble the blocks. But wouldn't it be nice if we could make those stitches match? So we'd have matching stitches on the edges of the block as well as the ones that go through the block to put the pieces together. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. We're going to cover how to create a custom motif stitch that matches the decorative stitch in your sewing machine that you want to use to assemble the blocks. And I mean by that, assemble the blocks together into a quilt. You can then use that stitch in your appliquilt block so that now the stitching will be consistent and match throughout the quilt. So over on the right hand side you'll see the decorative or motif stitch that I chose out of my sewing machine for this example. So that's a blow up of a couple of stitches, and at the bottom you can see what it would look like when I stitch the blocks together using that decorative stitch in my sewing machine. So first thing we need is a picture of your decorative stitch or motif stitch that comes out of your sewing machine. So get some fabric and sew out a motif stitch on your sewing machine. Sew quite a few of them because they don't always come out perfectly consistent, so we want to try and pick the best one. And when you sew it out, you want to make it as large as you can, and usually that means you're going to set your stitch width to be as large as it'll let you. And then we want to either scan it or take a picture of the set of stitches. Now, scanning it on a flatbed scanner is your best option. You're going to get the best picture. If you take a picture with your camera or with your phone, make sure that you hold the phone straight on to the stitches so it's not distorted. Easiest way to do that is to tack the stitches to the wall so you're not leaning over it. And then you also want to use the absolute highest resolution that you can, because we're going to be blowing this up quite big and we don't want it to be too pixelated. And lastly, remember where you saved the picture so when we bring it into Total Quilter, it'll be easy to find. So now we're going to cover what to do in Total Quilter. So go ahead and start up Total Quilter if you haven't already. And let's get our design space set up the same as mine. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure we are in metric mode. So you want to come up here to the ruler bar. You want to right click on the ruler bar, and this gives me a good chance to tell you that today if I want you to right click, I'm specifically going to say right click. If I just say click, that means a left click. And you'll want to make sure that your grid is showing. We're going to use snap to grid, so go ahead and turn that on now. Click snap to grid. Come back and right click once again on the ruler bar and click grid settings. Now we're going to use a very, very small grid setting. Ideally we would like to use a 1/2 millimeter grid setting because of the way that this motif stitch is set up. It's actually going to be a 6 by 7 millimeter stitch, and to get 7 divided into half, that's 3.5. So we'd like it to be at a 1/2 millimeter so we can get that 3.5 point. However, the grid settings does not allow 1/2 millimeter. 1 millimeter as low as we can go. So we're going to go ahead and set it to 1 millimeter for both the horizontal and the vertical. So I'm going to set them to 1. And my grid major, I'm going to tell you what we're going to set it to. It'll make a little bit more sense when we come back to this. But horizontally, we are going to have a stitch that is actually 6 millimeters in length. But since we can't work with 1/2 millimeters and only whole millimeters, we're actually going to double that. So we're actually going to use a 12. So we're going to come in here and put 12. And our vertical is 14, which is double of 7. So I'm going to go ahead and put in 14, and I'm going to click OK. And now we can't see anything because we are not zoomed in enough. So if I zoom in a lot, like to 600%, whoops, I didn't click it, hold on, 600%, now you'll start to see what our grid's going to look like. Now we're going to zoom in a lot more than this when we start working with our stitch, because that's actually way, way smaller than this. But you can see that the grid is still there. It was just in that zoomed out state. We really couldn't see it. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in our backdrop. And that's what we're going to bring in, that image that we saved of our motif stitches. We're going to save that, bring it in rather, as a backdrop. And that brings in an image file that stays static. And we're going to do that so we can trace over the top of it. So I'm going to use my load backdrop icon right here, my backdrop tool. And I'm going to click it. And it gives me the choice of a backdrop or a magic block. So in this case, we're going to choose backdrop. It's going to default to your images folder, but I've put the picture of the motif stitch that I want to duplicate on my desktop. So I'm going to click desktop. Then I'm going to scroll down till I find that picture. And there it is, motif. And so I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And you can see how small that is. So let me actually zoom into it by double clicking my magnifying glass tool. So I'm going to double click my magnifying glass tool, and now we're going to zoom into it. Now I scanned this at 1200 dots per inch or 1200 DPI, and you can still see at this size it's kind of fuzzy. So that's why I had you scan it in at the resolution, the highest resolution, so it wouldn't be even fuzzier or even indistinguishable. Now the grid right now is behind my backdrop, and I really want to overlay that grid on top. So I'm going to change a setting in my preferences here. So I'm going to go up to my program preferences, the gear icon, and click it. I'm going to go to the tab that says view, and there I'm going to check show backdrop below the grid. So right now the backdrop is on top of the grid, and we're going to change it so it goes below the grid by clicking this and clicking OK. And now you can see my backdrop is on top, but it's a little bit hard to see, and my default for the color of my grid major lines is purple. And I don't really want that. So we will, because it's hard to see over this pink. So we'll fix that in a second. The first thing we need to do is we need to actually scale this picture to make sure that it's the right size. Now remember, I told you that the real dimension from here to here, so the edges of this picture are this motif stitch is 7 millimeters across, or top to bottom in this view and 6 millimeters this way. Now the way it stitches out on the sewing machine, it actually stitches out running this way, but I've turned it when I scanned it because I want to work with it horizontally like this. But it really doesn't matter. So we're going to use a function in the software, part of the backdrop tool, that lets me scale this picture to the exact dimensions that it is in real life. To get that tool with the backdrop selected, and I haven't selected anything else, so my backdrop controls are still active here, I'm going to right click on it and I will get this menu that pops up, and one of the options here is define scale. Okay, and I'm going to click at one edge of these stitches and drag my cursor down to the other end of the stitches where the stitches end and let off the mouse. Now that's telling me it came in at 6.5 millimeters, and really what I want it to be is 7 millimeters. But remember, we're going to work at double scale, so I'm really going to multiply that by 2. So I'm going to go to 14 millimeters and I'm going to click OK, and it's going to blow that up. So I'm now going to double click my magnifying glass to bring it back down, and you can see now I've got more grid covering it. I hope you can see that. And it's a little bit skewed. So I could use my define horizon tool to straighten this out, but you know what? It's close enough for what we need to do. But what I'd really like to happen is I'd like these grid major lines to be actually in the center of my motif. So I'm just going to, with the motif selected here, and I'm talking about the backdrop, I'm going to click and drag it over a little bit till I get it approximately in the center. And I'm also going to line up that center line of stitching with my center line. And that's not totally perfect. Let me bring it over just a little bit more. So I'm going to, that's, this stitch is a little off because it's not totally straight, but we're going to use snap to grid. So we're going to straighten our stitching out when we create our motif stitch. So the next thing I want to do is make my grid lines a little bit more visible for you at home. So what I'm going to do is come up to my motif, or excuse me, my ruler bar here, and I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to go to my grid settings, and I'm going to change my default color here from gray, and I'm going to just click the down arrow, and I'm just going to choose black to make them a little bit easier to see. And I'm going to change this purple to something else because the purple blends in with the pink of my thread too much. So I'm going to actually change it to a nice bright yellow so I can see it, and I'm going to click OK. All right. And now what I want to do is I want to adjust my grid major lines. And when I told you to set it to 12 and 14, that was ideal. But what I forgot was I needed to divide that in half because I want a certain number above and a certain number below. And so I'm going to right click on my ruler bar one more time, go to grid settings, and instead of doing 12 and 14, I'm going to go back to 6 and 7 and say OK. All right, so now that's going to give me grid lines here that actually match the outer edges of the motif I want to create and shows me the center line. So I hope you can see that well enough. Let me zoom in just I zoomed out. Hold on, zoom in a little bit more. That's too much. All right, we're just going to go ahead and leave it right here. So this is the block, these yellow lines, that my motif is going to fit into, and I've got a line that goes across the center. So now we're going to start creating our motif stitches, and to do that I'm going to use my create a run stitch tool here. So this is digitizing a run stitch because that's what our motif is. So I'm going to click that, and now when I click on points here, it's going to allow me to put in stitches. Now I need to start a motif at the left hand side of my screen and end on the same horizontal plane at the right hand side of my screen. So basically I want to start at this major grid line intersection here, and I want to end at this one here, so the next stitch can start stitching right here. And so I need to get around and stitch all these things and get back over to here, hopefully without creating any double stitches. So this motif is pretty simple to do. So I'm going to start here on the left by clicking, and it'll snap to my grid point. And I'm going to come up here to this one and click. And I'm just going to create my major diamond first. So that's my outer diamond. Now you'll notice it's not exactly on the picture, but that's okay because I'm going to create one that's perfect in the software, and then it's going to get a little distorted as it stitches, and that's just what happens when you stitch things. So I'm going to come down here and click, as you see I did, and I'm going to come here and click. Now I have to come in and make this inner diamond. So I'm going to come up here, and I want to actually bring it out to match this one a little more. So we're going to come up 4 steps from the center. So I'm going to come up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and click. And I'm going to come back to this point and click. Now I'm going to come down 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and click. And then I'm going to come back over here and click. And now I need to come back to my point that goes out to make that stitch across the center and click. And then I'm going to right click to tell it I'm done creating those stitches. So I've created that motif, and I've done it by drawing over my backdrop as a guide. Now this is a simple enough motif that you probably could have looked at the stitch and just drawn it this way without bringing in the backdrop, but any way you want to do it is fine. Okay, so now that we've got our motif stitch created, I'm going to come over here to this tool. This is my show or hide the backdrop tool, and I'm going to hide my backdrop so it's not as distracting. And I'm going to actually turn on 3D for a second so you can see what our stitches that we've created look like. Now we have a couple more things to do to make this into a perfect motif stitch. And so I'm going to turn off 3D again so this is a little easier to see. Let me double click now so that it will zoom in to our stitches. And I'm going to turn on something that you hardly ever use, and that's this icon right here, stitch points, so I can see my stitch points. And you can see these little black dots, and I hope you can pick them up at home. But I've got all these little black dots here showing me where the stitch points are. And that's because when I created this run stitch, my stitch length was 2.5 millimeters. And so that's going to put extra stitches in here that I don't really want for this motif stitch. So I'm going to actually change my stitch length here from 2.5 to something big so that it only puts stitch points at the anchors. And those are the points where I click. Those are called the anchors. And that's what this drop run stitch is all about. Right here, drop run stitch at anchor. That means it's always going to take a stitch at the anchor point, which is exactly what I want. But I don't want any in between. So as long as I set this value to be bigger than where my anchor points are, all I'm going to get is stitches at my anchor points. So I'm going to try a 7 millimeter and click apply and see if that gets rid of them. Yeah, it got rid of the stitches in between. Nope, it didn't. It left these stitches here. And you know why it did that? Because I forgot that we are working at double scale. So before we do this, let's go over to our transform and let's reduce our size to the size that we actually want to stitch this at, which is 7 millimeters in height and not 14. So I've got maintain aspect ratio turned on. So if I change this to 7, that'll change to 6, and that'll be our actual height that we want to stitch this at. So I'm going to do that and click apply. And now it's smaller. Let me double click to zoom in. And now you can see now that I have the exact size, that stitch that was in the middle here, it went away. And now we're at the actual size where this will stitch out correctly. So looking at this, you can see now that the stitches in the middle of my lines have gone away, but I got these extra little stitches right here. Now what are those? Those are actually the lock stitches at the beginning and end of this pattern. And normally when we create a big run stitch pattern, we want to automatically put in a lock stitch or tie in, tie off stitch at the beginning and end so it doesn't unravel. But this is actually going to stitch contiguously as a row of stitches, so we don't want to have lock stitches at the beginning and the end of each individual pattern, so we need to turn those off. So we're going to come in here to the Commands tab, and we're going to go to our tie in and tie off, and we're going to change both of those to none. Okay, so I'm going to change them to none and click Apply, and now you can see I've got a perfectly clean design with no tie-ins and tie-offs and only stitch points where I want them to be. And all I need to do now is save this as a motif stitch. So the way I need to do that is I need to come over here to my toolbar on the left and go into stitch mode. And I'm going to do that by clicking the stitch tool. And when I do that, my screens are going to change to show me that I'm in stitch mode. I don't really need to do anything with any of these, but I do need to select all the stitches that I want to be in that motif. So I'm going to do that by coming up here and clicking and dragging a selection box around the whole thing and let off my mouse, and now I've selected all the stitches in that design. Now normally you might be able to use Control A, which is select everything. That doesn't work when you're in stitch mode. It only works when you're in normal select mode. But now I have all the stitches in my design selected. Now I can come up here to my tools and I can go to my motif pattern editor and I can select Save Motif Pattern. Now it's going to bring up a preview of what this is going to look like when it stitches. It shows it to you as if it was in a motif fill, which you can use in the software, but we are not going to use it as a fill. We're just going to use it as a single line. But this is the preview that it shows you. And all I'm going to do now is click Save, and I need to give it a name. So I'm going to save this as Sewing Motif. So I'm just going to call it Sewing. You can call it whatever you want, and I'm going to press Save, and that saves it as that motif. All right, so that has created our motif. Now, a mistake that a lot of people make, I'm just going to show you this, is if you're here and you go to save this motif pattern, so we're not in stitch mode, and you come up here to the tools and go to the motif pattern editor, you'll see you could load in a motif pattern, but save motif is grayed out. So you have to be in stitch mode with the stitches you want to save as a motif in order for this to light up. So now how do we use this? Well, let's bring in that block that we looked at in the slide presentation. So let's go ahead and open up a new page, and we're going to load in an appliquilt block, and so that was this magic window block here, and we're going to change the default stitch here, which is this cross pattern, into the new one that we just created. So in order to select these lines, I have to remember go into appliquilt select mode, which is this object selection right here, this one. Then I'm going to click on all the lines that I want to change. So I'm going to click on that one. I'm going to hold down Control and click on that one. I'm continuing to hold down Control, clicking all the lines. That one goes all the way around. Click on this one. That one goes all the way around. Let's try this one. That goes all the way around. So that's actually all the stitches, all the lines in my design. So over here you can see that it's defaulted to that appliquilt binding motif. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click this drop down here, change to motif, and then I should be able to see that motif that I created in my list here. So there's some F's, and as I get down, you see here I've got one called Sewing. You can see some other ones I had as tests. So this is the one we just created called Sewing, and you can see that they're in purple to show you that's a custom one. And when I click it, it's going to come in. It's going to default to a pattern size of 3 millimeters, which is too small. So we're going to change that to 7, and we're going to click Apply. And now we've got that motif pattern applied to our appliquilt block. Let me turn on 3D so you can see what that looks like. So now when we stitch this out, it would match the actual stitches that we would have in our design. So that completes this lesson. So I want to thank you for watching and invite you to come back next month for our next video in the Total Quilter Monthly Series.